Helmand Province, Afghanistan, winter 2008. A British Army reconnaissance aircraft, small, light, built for low-altitude passes over suspected Taliban supply routes, takes fire from the ridgeline to the east, not a lucky shot. Coordinated small arms fire from multiple positions that converge on the airframe with the kind of discipline that tells you immediately these are not farmers with rifles. These are fighters who've been doing this for years, who know their angles, who've been waiting. The aircraft goes down, not in a fireball. It loses control in a way that becomes irreversible, and the man aboard does the only thing left, punches out over hostile valley floor, over terrain that the men who just shot that aircraft down have controlled for the better part of a decade. One man, one parachute, descending into their ground. In a command post 17 kilometers to the northeast, a U.S. Army liaison officer watching a drone feed goes quiet. He'd been logging reports, had a coffee cooling on the desk, was doing the 1,000 small things that constitute existence in a forward operating base when it isn't actively on fire. He watches the parachute open. He watches what looks like 12 to 15 men converging on the landing zone from 3 separate directions. He keys his radio and starts talking fast. Then he watches something happen on that screen that he will spend the next several years trying to explain to people who weren't in that room. 40 seconds. 12 men down. 1 man walking. The remaining fighters scatter into the rock and scrub. The single figure moves through the aftermath with a calm and a purpose that does not look like relief, doesn't look like adrenaline, doesn't look like anything this officer has a reference for. He will later describe it in his after-action statement as the most clinical thing he has ever seen a human being do. Not violent, not heroic, clinical, like watching a technician finish a job. The question that kept him up in that bunk for weeks afterward wasn't about the shooting itself. It was about the before, about those 40 seconds between touchdown and first shot. What was happening inside that man's head while 15 armed fighters closed on his position from 3 directions through terrain they knew better than their own homes? What does a human being do with that information? What does a human being do with that fear? The answer to that question is the entire story. By 2008, the coalition had been in Afghanistan for 7 years. The initial invasion had been a masterpiece of asymmetric speed, small teams, air power, local allies, moving faster than the Taliban could adapt to. That phase was long over. What replaced it was something that large conventional military organizations are structurally ill-equipped to handle. A war without front lines, without uniforms, without a defined enemy formation to close with and destroy. A war where the Taliban's greatest tactical asset was its ability to simply not be where you were looking. Helmand Province was the clearest expression of this. Roughly the size of West Virginia, it had become the most violent patch of ground in Afghanistan by 2008. British forces had taken over primary responsibility there from the Americans in 2006, walking into a situation that initial assessments had catastrophically underestimated. What was projected as a stabilization mission had become a full-spectrum counterinsurgency fight against an enemy that could mass for a complex attack and then dissolve back into the civilian population before the helicopters arrived. An enemy with an intimate knowledge of the terrain that no amount of satellite imagery could replicate. The resources deployed were staggering. Thousands of personnel, hundreds of vehicles, a network of forward operating bases, surveillance assets, logistics chains stretching back to Kandahar and beyond, aircraft that could see heat signatures through cloud cover, intelligence networks employing thousands of analysts across multiple time zones. And the Taliban was still there, 7 years in, holding ground, laying IEDs on the routes that mattered, moving fighters through the green zone. Still there by the only metric that mattered in counterinsurgency, which wasn't body count, but persistence. A grinding, bone-deep awareness had settled into British and American units in Helmand that the math didn't work, that the technology wasn't delivering the promised clarity, that the enemy refused to stand and fight where firepower could reduce him to statistics. Into this landscape, operating from a location that most conventional forces in Helmand didn't know about and wouldn't have been told about if they'd asked, was a detachment of the British Special Air Service. Not a squadron, a detachment, a number so small that when certain American commanders were first briefed on the SAS presence in their area of operations, their immediate response was, "That can't be right. That's not enough people to change anything." Those commanders were wrong. And the way they discovered they were wrong was the kind of professional reckoning that reshapes a career's worth of assumptions about how military effectiveness is generated. The SAS in Helmand in 2008 was running a sustained direct action campaign against the Taliban's mid-level command structure, the layer of experienced fighters and facilitators who provided the connective tissue between senior leadership and foot soldiers. Not the top tier, insulated across the border in Pakistan. Not the low-level fighters, too numerous and replaceable to meaningfully degrade. The middle, the commanders of individual cells, the bomb makers, the logistics coordinators, the men who understood the geography and the relationships well enough to make the local insurgency function. The SAS was taking them apart one by one at a pace that American and British intelligence analysts found, frankly, difficult to reconcile with the size of the force generating it. One senior American officer, reviewing reporting from Helmand in late 2008, asked his intelligence staff point-blank whether there was a larger SAS element that wasn't being disclosed to him. He could not process the operational tempo, the number of precision engagements, the specificity of the intelligence being acted on, the rate at which Taliban command nodes were going dark, as the product of a force as small as the one in the briefing. The answer he received was that no, there was no larger undisclosed element. The briefing reflected reality. He sat with that for a moment and then said something that made it into more than one after-action report. Then we've been measuring the wrong things. To understand what that detachment was actually doing, you have to understand what the selection process that produced its operators was actually selecting for. Because it was not selecting for what most people think military selection selects for. The British SAS selection process does not care about your fitness scores or your leadership evaluations, or how many people think you're going to make it. The physical demands, the long solo navigation marches across the Brecon beacons in Wales, conducted with progressively heavier loads in weather that ranges from miserable to actively dangerous, with no encouragement, no clear progress indicators, no emotional support of any kind, are not the point. They are the delivery mechanism for something else. The method by which the selection staff systematically strips away every external source of motivation and every internal source of ego until what's left is the true bottom of the man. Not his best self. Not his performance under controlled conditions, his actual floor, because what the SAS needs isn't a man who performs well when he's rested and supported. Any army in the world can produce those. What the SAS needs is a man whose floor is higher than most people's ceiling. Most candidates who attempt selection are exceptional soldiers by conventional standards. They fail not because they are weak, but because the process surfaces the gap between performing well and being constituted differently. Those are not the same thing, and that gap is what gets you killed in the kind of operations the SAS runs. What emerged from that selection, from the combat survival training, the close quarters battle work, the intelligence gathering techniques, the vehicle and demolitions and medical pipelines, was a human being who had been reconstituted at the level of his stress response architecture. Not desensitized to fear. That's a misunderstanding. Desensitization makes you reckless. It makes you miss threats. It kills you. What the training produced was a man who felt fear as acutely as anyone else and had, through hundreds of repetitions under progressively more extreme conditions, developed the automatic capacity to metabolize that fear in real time, to convert it from paralysis into usable information. Fear tells you where the danger is. Fear tells you how serious it is. The SAS operator had learned to read that instrument the way a mechanic reads gauges. Not with panic, but with attention. The cool, specific interest of a professional doing exactly the work he was built to do. That is what the Taliban fighters in that valley in 2008 could not account for when they converged on the landing zone. They had one man on the ground, one man alone, who had just survived a crash ejection, with no visible support, no unit, no armor behind him. In their experience, years of experience fighting coalition forces, learning what their fear looked like, learning what made them freeze. A soldier alone in their valley was a prize. The logic was mathematical and seemed irrefutable. 15 against 1, in terrain they had owned for years. For a moment, briefly, some of them laughed. That laughter would be the last mistake those 12 men ever made. The aircraft had come down in late morning, when the light in Helmand sits flat and gray and the mountains to the east cast long shadows that cut the valley into alternating bands of cold brightness and cold dark. The ejection was at low altitude, barely enough time for the canopy to deploy before the ground arrived. No opportunity to assess the landing zone. You go out, the chute opens, you hit in whatever the terrain has for you. In that part of Helmand, the valley floor is compacted rock and hard frozen silt, broken by irrigation channels and low stone walls that predate the entire modern history of the country. The landing was hard, not catastrophic. The operator was trained for emergency bailout, but hard in the way that full spine impacts are hard, the kind that leave you breathless and rattled even when nothing is broken, that demand a moment of biological inventory before you trust your body to move. He didn't take the moment. He couldn't, because already, before he was fully oriented, he could hear them. Not footsteps, voices. The cadence and volume of men moving with confidence. Men who hadn't lowered their voices because they hadn't yet understood that they needed to. They were talking to each other with the relaxed energy of hunters who've spotted their quarry from a comfortable range. He didn't need to understand the language to read that cadence. He knew exactly what it meant. He did not run. Here is the thing about running that tactical training corrects and movies consistently fail to reflect. Running feels like action. Running feels like doing something about the problem. And running, in an open valley with no cover and a group of armed men converging from 3 directions, is the fastest way to end up at maximum disadvantage. Running takes you away from what you know about their positions. Running makes noise. Running collapses your tactical options down to a single predictable vector that anyone on a ridgeline can read and cut off before you get there. He assessed the terrain, not a leisurely survey, a rapid categorization of usable features, the kind of environmental reading that becomes automatic after enough time in complex terrain, where you stop thinking of landscape as geography and start thinking of it as a problem with spatial variables. He saw the ground fall slightly to the north, a shallow depression fed by a dry irrigation channel. He saw a crumbled section of low stone wall 200 meters northeast. He tracked the sight lines from the eastern ridgeline against the angles of the converging voices, and identified the one approach corridor that wasn't yet covered. He moved, not running. Moving, controlled, low, fast, using the terrain's shadows and folds, treating every piece of cover as a transition point rather than a destination. The C8 was already in his hands. The C8 is a short-barreled variant of the C7 assault rifle, compact enough for the close-in work that SAS operators do with a frequency conventional forces rarely match, accurate enough for these distances, reliable in the cold and the dust. He had the rounds he'd gone up in the aircraft with. In the economy of what was about to happen, they were enough. He reached the elevated position before the first group rounded the low ground to the south. The position wasn't perfect. There is no perfect position in a valley with armed men approaching from 3 directions, but it gave him what he needed. 2 clean sight lines intersecting the most probable approach corridors, a rock formation at his back eliminating one arc of exposure, and enough elevation to alter the geometry of the engagement in his favor. Not perfect, sufficient. He was not looking for perfect. He was looking for the specific conditions under which what he was about to do was executable. The voices were close now, close enough to hear individual footsteps on the rock, to hear the metallic sounds of weapons carried without tactical discipline, safety selectors in the wrong position, slings rattling, a hand hitting a receiver carelessly, men who weren't thinking about a firefight, they were thinking about a capture. They expected to find a downed pilot in shock, hands shaking, who would either surrender or take a panicked shot and give away his position. They expected exactly what a downed airman in that situation would be. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that the man who had ejected from that aircraft was not a pilot. He was an SAS operator who had been using the aircraft for a close-in surveillance run on a suspected logistics route that required a human eye rather than a camera. He watched the leading element of the southern group come around the rock formation into the open ground below his position. Watched them scan forward toward where they expected to find their prize. Watched them completely miss his position because it was above them and behind their expectation, and because they were not thinking about the possibility that they were walking into an ambush. Because you don't walk into an ambush when you are 15 pursuing one. That is not how the arithmetic of combat works, except that it is. Under specific conditions, with a specific man on the other end of the equation, that is exactly how the arithmetic works. The first trigger pull was not the beginning of a moment of violence. It was the end of a calculation. By the time his finger moved, the engagement was already determined in his head. Not the exact sequence, the battlefield never allows that certainty, but the framework was locked. He knew the order of priority. He knew which targets closed his window of advantage first. He knew that in this geometry, with this distribution of men across his available sight lines, the rate of accurate fire he was capable of sustaining gave him an interval in which the remaining fighters would still be processing what was happening. Still in the cognitive delay between perceiving a lethal threat and formulating a coordinated response. That interval, the gap between a man's nervous system registering that something catastrophically wrong is happening and his ability to do something organized about it, is measured in fractions of a second for a trained soldier and several seconds for an untrained one. Several seconds is an eternity in a close engagement. Several seconds, multiplied across 15 men who are all experiencing it simultaneously for the first time, is sufficient time to do what he did. The reports came out of that valley fast, 2, 3, 4 in rapid succession, each one from a slightly shifted position, because a stationary shooter is a predictable shooter, and predictable in a close firefight is a liability. Between shots he was moving, inches, not feet, shifting the geometry of his position relative to the targets, maintaining cover, working the C8 with a mechanical fluency that was not thought. It happened below conscious decision, the way a concert pianist's fingers find the keys without the brain tracking each one. Thousands of repetitions had moved this below the threshold of deliberation. There was no thinking happening in that sense. There was only execution, precise, sequenced, absolutely without panic. 12 men, 40 seconds. The surviving fighters stopped, and the stillness that followed was the specific stillness of men whose conceptual model of reality has just been shattered. Not the stillness of tactical decision-making, the stillness of cognitive failure, the absolute inability to integrate what had just happened with any prior understanding of how an engagement with a single target works. They had 15 men and one enemy. They had watched the arithmetic execute in a direction the math had said was impossible. And in that stillness, in those 2 or 3 seconds of collective neural freeze, the operator had already moved again. When they finally ran, he let them run. Not because he couldn't have pursued. Because pursuit changes the tactical calculation entirely, extends your exposure, pulls you into terrain you haven't assessed, turns a decisive engagement into a running fight with unknown variables. He let them run because it was tactically correct, and because what they carried out of that valley with them was worth more than their elimination. What they carried was a payload, a story that would move through Taliban communication networks in Helmand with a velocity and a specificity that no psychological operations campaign could have engineered. The American liaison officer at the command post 17 kilometers northeast had been on his radio from the moment the aircraft went down, called for a quick reaction force, called for close air support to stand by, had been doing the brutal math on response times versus the situation on the ground, and the math hadn't been encouraging. He was watching the drone feed with the specific dread of a man watching something bad unfold just outside the range of his ability to stop it. He watched the engagement happen in the compressed, slightly unreal quality that drone feeds have, that combination of surveillance clarity and physical remove. He watched it, and when it was over he didn't say anything for several seconds. Not because he had nothing to say, because he didn't have language for it. None of his training had given him a word for what he'd just watched a single man do. His after-action report was filed 12 hours later. The last sentence read, "I have been in this theater for 14 months, and I have never seen anything that made me feel like I needed to completely reconsider what one man can do." That sentence found its way into briefings and evaluations at levels above the command post, and it planted the right question in the right minds. But the more immediate consequence was what the 3 surviving fighters did with what they'd seen. They talked. People do that with experiences that break their conceptual frameworks. They distribute the incomprehensible, trying to find in someone else's reaction a validation that, yes, it happened, you are not losing your mind. The story moved through Taliban communication channels in Helmand, with a specificity that confirmed it was not being dismissed as exaggeration. It confirmed something that senior Taliban commanders in the province had been quietly noting for months, that encounters with the British SAS produced outcomes that didn't follow the rules that years of fighting coalition forces had established. There had always been fear of the SAS in Taliban ranks. Real fear, earned through specific encounters over years of operations. The SAS had been taking apart the Taliban's command structure in Helmand with a consistency that produced genuine organizational disruption. Not just the loss of individual commanders, but the slow poisoning of the Taliban's confidence in any position. any route, any gathering that might become a target. Experienced commanders who had moved freely through Helmand's districts for years found themselves adopting irregular, unpredictable movement patterns, the supreme irony of the hunted adopting the habits of the hunter. But there is a specific quality to the fear of an invisible enemy, an enemy you know through results but whose methods remain opaque. And a different quality to the fear of an enemy whose capabilities you have just witnessed directly, up close, with no ambiguity about what you saw. The fighters who ran from that valley didn't have a ghost story. They had a data point. 1 man, 1 rifle, 40 seconds, 12 dead. Irreducible, concrete, not rationalizable as luck or poor positioning. It was what it was. A British human intelligence source working in central Helmand, in the months that followed, described a behavioral change in Taliban units operating in the districts where SAS presence was active. Units that had previously been willing to aggressively pursue isolated contacts, to exploit what appeared to be vulnerable single targets, were hesitating, not retreating, not refusing to fight, hesitating, inserting a delay between stimulus and response that, in tactical terms, is the difference between an effective ambush and a blown one, between a coordinated assault and a fumbled one. An interpreter working with British forces in Sangjin described overhearing Taliban fighters say that they no longer trusted what they saw, that a lone man in an open position was no longer necessarily what it appeared to be, that the math couldn't be trusted anymore. That is a profound psychological change to inflict on a fighting force. You can measure territory, you can count casualties, you can track infrastructure degraded and supply routes disrupted, but the most decisive thing you can do to an enemy is corrupt his decision-making process, plant doubt at the intersection of observation and action, in the milliseconds between seeing something and deciding what to do about it. A fighter who hesitates at that intersection is a fighter whose tactical effectiveness has been halved, regardless of his training or his weapons or his commitment to the cause. Now here is the part that most accounts of special operations leave out, because it doesn't fit the narrative of superhuman invincibility that makes for better television. It was breaking the men who did it, not breaking in the sense of failure. Breaking in the sense that the human body and the human mind were not designed to operate at this tempo, this intensity, this continuous exposure to life and death decision-making, this duration, with this little recovery between operations. The SAS detachment in Helmand was running at a pace that their own commanders acknowledged, in private, was not indefinitely sustainable. The missions came fast because the intelligence was good and because the enemy was moving and because the nature of the target set meant there was always another target the moment you'd taken down the last one. The machine didn't stop. The machine demanded. Operators who had been through months of deployment at this tempo came back changed, not presenting with the classical markers that military welfare systems are designed to detect, changed in subtler ways, a difficulty with stillness, an inability to operate comfortably in environments without threat, because the nervous system had been calibrated to a level of alert that civilian life couldn't accommodate. A tendency toward isolation not because they couldn't function socially, but because social function, after what they had been doing, felt like pretending in a way that was exhausting rather than restorative. What held this together was not willpower in the motivational poster sense. It was the brotherhood, and that is not a recruitment phrase. It is the mechanical reality of what kept these men functional. The specific bond that forms between operators who have been through selection together, who have put their lives physically in each other's hands in conditions where the margin for error is zero, is not like other relationships. It operates below the level of language, in the domain of automatic trust. The knowledge, not the belief, the bone-level knowledge, that the man next to you will do what needs to be done. When the body is failing, when the accumulated sleep deficit and physical punishment and cognitive load begin to erode the machinery. What keeps an SAS operator going is not abstract courage. It is the refusal to be the one who stops. Not because stopping is philosophically wrong. Because the man next to you needs you not to stop, and the specific irreducible weight of that need, his face, his dependence, the fact that you have both made it this far by neither of you stopping, is heavier than physical exhaustion. Every time. It has to be, otherwise the math doesn't work. The math worked. In Helmand in 2008 and into 2009, the SAS detachment produced results that were, by any rational measure, disproportionate to their size by a factor that conventional military thinking couldn't fully accommodate. The Taliban's mid-level command structure in central Helmand was significantly degraded. Networks that had operated with organizational coherence for years had been disrupted. IED facilitators who had been active for multiple fighting seasons were gone. The connective tissue that made the local insurgency function was fraying, not because of the mass of the force opposing it, but because of the precision and the pace. A British brigadier reviewing the Helmand intelligence picture in late 2009 described the SAS contribution in terms that career military men use when they are trying to be precise about something that sits uncomfortably with their professional framework. He said they had changed the geometry, not the landscape, the geometry. The underlying logical relationships between forces and capabilities that commanders use to make decisions about resource allocation and mission priority. The SAS had demonstrated, in the most concrete terms available, that the value of a small force operating with intelligence and precision was not commensurable with the value of a large force operating with mass and firepower. You could not substitute one for the other on the same scale. They were producing different things. The SAS was producing, specifically, the erosion of the enemy's confidence in his own operational environment. The slow conversion of Taliban strongholds in central Helmand from places of organizational certainty into places of psychological uncertainty. And psychological uncertainty, sustained over months in an insurgent organization whose greatest asset was local knowledge and freedom of movement, does more damage than any single kinetic event can measure. The American officer who'd filed the after-action report was redeployed before he could see the full shape of what he'd watched begin. But others who accessed the Helmand intelligence picture across that period began to assemble it, began to understand not just what had been achieved, but how the proportionality of it overturned assumptions that had been guiding coalition strategy since the first year of the war. The metric they had been using, scale, mass, firepower ratio, territory held, was not wrong exactly. It just wasn't measuring the relevant variable. It couldn't capture what an SAS operator in a valley in winter, alone, with a C8 and 40 seconds and a decision-making architecture built in the Bricon beacons, could actually do to an insurgency that thought it had found a gift when the parachute appeared in the morning sky. The 15 Taliban fighters who converged on that landing zone, laughing, were the distilled expression of a mistake their organization had been making about the SAS since 2001. They had been applying conventional military logic, mass, numbers, positional advantage, to an adversary whose capabilities operated on a completely different logic. They were reading the situation with instruments that didn't measure the relevant variable. The relevant variable was not the number of men on the ground. It was the quality of the decision-making at the point of contact. And at the point of contact in that valley, with 15 armed men closing from 3 directions, the quality of that decision-making was of a different order than anything the Taliban's years of combat had prepared them to account for. Not because the man on the ground was superhuman, because he was the product of a system, a selection process, a training methodology, a decade of accumulated organizational learning, built to produce exactly one thing: a man whose performance under maximum stress did not look like a human performance curve. 12 of those 15 would never learn the lesson. The 3 who ran carried it with them. And what they carried, that specific, irreducible, unrationalizable data point, was worth more to the coalition's campaign in Helmand than any single conventional operation of that period, because they distributed it, because in distributing it they planted in the Taliban's operational culture a seed of the right kind of doubt, not the generalized, manageable fear of a dangerous adversary. The specific, corrosive uncertainty of an adversary whose behavior doesn't follow the rules that make combat predictable. An adversary who falls from a burning aircraft into your strongest ground, alone, and turns the encounter into 40 seconds of surgical elimination. They had seen one man eject from a damaged aircraft. They had seen a trophy, a propaganda victory, proof that even the SAS fell. They had seen all of that in the arc of one parachute against the gray Helmand sky. The math said to laugh, 15-1 in their territory against a man who just survived a crash. The math was wrong. It had always been wrong. They just didn't know it until those 40 seconds were over. That is the thing about a weapon that isn't measured in caliber or range or explosive yield. That is the thing about a weapon that lives inside a man's nervous system. Inside his ability to process catastrophic information without the fraction of a second of panic that changes everything. Inside his automatic access to the muscle memory of 1,000 rehearsed lethal decisions. You can't see it coming on a surveillance feed. You can't account for it in a pre-mission brief. You can't quantify it in the intelligence estimate that tells you whether a lone figure on a valley floor is a threat or a target. By the time you find out, the 40 seconds are already over, and the laughter has gone quiet for good.